Thank you so much, Philip. And I guess it's good afternoon to everyone in the attendance. So the title of my talk today is Teaching Slavery in Scotland, Embracing an Empathetic Pedagogy. And this somewhat relates to what Karen had just announced a few minutes ago. So you'll see what I mean. So back in 2021, Professor Diana Payton at the University of Edinburgh approached the Beniba Center for Slavery Studies to collaborate on a project to establish a network of teachers and academics to improve Scottish schools' teaching of the transatlantic slave trade and the history of Atlantic slavery. Many of us have been aware of the demand from school students for a curriculum that decenters the colonial gaze in the teaching of empire and replaces it with an approach drawing on the lived experiences and perspectives of colonized and enslaved peoples. And as a side note, I am a parent of a biracial child in secondary school in Perthshire, and it's been a source of criticism for me and other Black parents and guardians. Now, for this project, we targeted secondary school students in Scotland as beneficiaries whose teachers will have access to world-leading research into the history of empire, race, and slavery. We aimed to disseminate new research into Atlantic slavery conducted by research groups at the University of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Collectively, this research takes a social and economic history approach to many topics that are of relevance to the SQA National 5 British paper, part 3, called The Atlantic Slave Trade from 1770 to about 1807, and the higher paper, Britain, part C, The Atlantic Slave Trade, as well as the broad general education element of the curriculum taught to children between the ages of 11 and 14, and of course, to enrich the teaching of these themes. Now, we felt confident that the Teaching Slavery in Scotland project would offer secondary school students the opportunity to draw on a wealth of recently published and ongoing research at Glasgow and Edinburgh, which collectively centers on these experiences and strategies of enslaved people. That also adds to our understanding of the significance of Atlantic slavery to Scotland in particular, and vice versa. So the key members were Dr. Marissa Wilson, a senior lecturer of the School of Geoscience at University of Edinburgh, of course, Professor Diana Payton, and from the Beniba Center and University of Glasgow, it was myself and Dr. Christine White, a lecturer in global history, as well as Dr. Yelmer Voss and Dr. Chantel George, both also lecturers in global history. We also had key members who were Kate Hunter, a history teacher at an Edinburgh secondary school who's experienced in teaching slavery and has attended a previous residential that was hosted by the Historical Society. But also to broaden and enrich this project, we included Lisa Williams, who is the founder of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association and of Edinburgh's Black History Walks. And Lisa's involvement was crucial as she has substantial experience working in Scottish schools on topics related to slavery. Also, we had Dr. Joe Smith, a lecturer in education from the University of Stirling, who is formerly a secondary history teacher and department head, and now is researching school history education. But we also made sure to engage with two sets of non-academic partners. First were the Scottish councils, that includes Edinburgh, Inverclyde, Glasgow, Dundee, and East Renfrewshire, and for whom the improving of teaching of Black history, and I say including but not limited to the history of slavery, is an important priority for them. They have demonstrated their commitment to the project by offering match funding to provide teachers with cover to allow them to attend our weekend residential training that we had. And secondly, the project was built on existing links between the team and the Scottish Association of History Teachers from here on. I'll just use SAF. We established these planning meetings over several months in 2021, and through the contributions to the SAF annual conference. They were essential in facilitating recruitment of teacher participants and also the evaluation and dissemination of the project's tangible outcomes. Now, we successfully secured an ERSC Impact Acceleration Grant under the goals to establish, support, and sustain a network of teachers, academics, and anti-racist pedagogy experts to improve the teaching of slavery, empire, and race in Scotland, and of course, drawing especially from the research of the co-applicants. In essence, we wanted to develop and publicize a set of teacher-produced, peer-reviewed online resources hosted by SAF and supported by Education Scotland. We also wanted to build capacity to teach topics related to the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in that broad general education, national 5 and higher levels, especially on the themes of gender, slavery, foodways, and Scottish connections to Atlantic slavery, as well as African connections to the Atlantic slave trade. We also wanted to build a robust system for the dissemination of slavery-related research across Scottish schools in different council areas and monitor the effectiveness of the system to ensure continuous improvement. Now, in addition, we planned for this evaluation of impact of the project on the teacher professional development. So Dr. Joe Smith was our lead researcher in this for the project's impact, with data collected at 3 different checkpoints. That was before the residential weekend, immediately after the weekend, and 6 months later, as we were developing some of these outputs. Furthermore, we also made sure that ethical approval was secured by both the University of Stirling as well as University of Glasgow. Now, the materials for these sessions will be hosted online, hopefully in a few weeks, in a couple of weeks, on SAF's website, which will allow download data to be collected. And it will be possible to know from this both the number of times resources are downloaded and its geographical reach. And more informally, members of staff will report to us on the use of the materials by teachers. So as the core applicants are committed to sustaining the network in the long term, we'll be able to continue to follow up its effects as we continue to support Scottish teachers in teaching slavery. Out of a maximum of 24 teachers, we ended up recruiting a network of 21 from local authority areas across Scotland to attend the residential training weekend and the related follow-up activities. The residential weekend was held at a retreat in Aberdeenshire and was guided by 7 big ideas. Number one, African societies were complex and diverse and thus responded in complex and diverse ways to European demand for captives. Number two, enslaved people's resistance to and strategies for surviving enslavement were complex and diverse. Number three, primary sources and case studies allowed us to challenge the stereotypes of the Atlantic slave system. The next was non-written sources and reading sources against the grain are crucial in uncovering marginalized perspectives, because the archive of slavery in general is meant to, at best, minimize or marginalize the active voices of the enslaved, and at worst, completely silence them all altogether, which is why we need to read against the grain. Another big idea was that Atlantic slavery strongly influenced economies, societies, cultural and racial formations, not only in Europe, and certainly across Scotland. Another was societies dominated by slavery were integrated into the development of the modern world and demonstrate many characteristics we think of as modern. And finally, the cultural, ideological, and economic inheritances of the Atlantic slavery system have strongly affected and continue to affect the world we live in today. The setting for the weekend, and pretty much for the rest of the project, was underpinned by a clarity in terms of language, practice, that was foreground in what Lisa Williams calls a brave space. That is, to promote an anti-racist set of principles and practice in teaching slavery. And this is distinct from what we tend to say, which is we want to create a safe space for people. And it was distinct from that safe space in several ways, beginning with teachers needing to examine their own positionality. Ms. Williams highlighted 5 qualities or experiences that included, number one, what strategies do you, as a secondary school teacher, use to humanize a story? Number two, how can we create empathy for people's experiences? And that means past and present, especially when we talk about students in the classroom who are descended from enslaved people. Number three, how do we explain with respect, dignity, and a sense of agency? Number four, what do you see as problematic in current approaches? And number five, what change would you like to make, and how can your school support you? And finally, Ms. Williams emphasizes that the creation of a brave space is less about worrying that you'll say something wrong, but it's more about being able to do what she calls brave listening. So throughout the weekend, teachers and guest lecturers and scholars worked on various groups to focus on a particular topic or theme, then alternate so that other participants had in-depth time to engage with all of the sessions. Most of the session's format was characterized by having a discussant and someone to facilitate. After lunch, we would just take some breaks, have some voluntary walks through the very beautiful and scenic property grounds. And the workday tended to finish with a session on inquiry-based learning and guidance on how we're going to try to take all that they're learning and make it into a teaching resource. So during the first day, there was one session on the Scottish and Caribbean connections. And that session focused on the role of Scots in constructing and sustaining Atlantic slavery. as well as the economic and social impact of Atlantic slavery on Scotland, with particular case studies relating to Brunache and the formation of the Sandbach Tyne Company through trading networks across the Southern Caribbean, as well as the role of border doctors that turned into planters like William and James Chisholm in the development of slavery in Jamaica. The session on Africa and Atlantic slavery explored the impact of Atlantic slavery on specific African societies, including their role of liberated Africans and the importance of slavery to the economy of Angola. Participants and key core members of the projects could continue their discussions and expand their learning during the free time and dinner and afterwards. Now, at the start of the second day, we took time in small groups to reflect on the lessons and discussions of the previous day. We wanted to take time to answer lingering or possibly new questions that might have arisen after a night of reflection on their own. So after that, we went into new sessions, and one of them was on the everyday life in the Caribbean, focusing on work, children, gender, and the importance of healthcare and healing practices in Caribbean slave societies. And the second morning session broadly examined the significance of African cultural practices in the Caribbean, and then used the case study of Grenada as an exemplification. The next portion of the day was dedicated to food, Atlantic slavery, and the global economy. This session focused on the role of the sugar industry in transforming foodways, not just in the West Indies, but certainly in Scotland during the first part the first part of that afternoon. And the second part of that session, which was more of my contribution, centered on the diet, cuisine, and foodways of enslaved peoples in the Caribbean. And both part of that session, both parts, we really wanted to focus as much attention on women's roles in resistance to slavery. Now, to help diversify the ways of learning, my part of the session included an experiential segment. The first part was to help ground an understanding about the relationship to sugar cultivation and the brutal violence inflicted upon Black bodies. Now, obviously, we know that the Atlantic slave economy, regardless of what commodities were cultivated and produced for export, inherently intertwined with the brutal exploitation, dehumanization, and systematic torture and killing of enslaved Africans. However, with sugarcane culture, there was something quite unique. So to that session, I brought 2 sugarcane cuts for the teachers to see, to touch and feel, and mostly to smell. Too often our modern societies we're completely unaware of the original state of some of our most ubiquitous food staples, like sugar. Everyone knows sugar, but how many have actually seen sugar cane? So I presented 1 fresh cut sugar cane, and the other sugar cane cut had stayed out for more than a couple of days. The oxidation process causes the juice in sugarcane to ferment. And so I encourage teachers to smell the difference between a fresh cut sugarcane and one that had begun to spoil. The fermenting, rotting, sweet scent is immediate on the senses. Sugarcane juice oxidizes even quicker, and it becomes toxic within 20 minutes. So it's a simple exercise that drives home the part of the reason why violence was so inextricably linked with sugarcane culture. Sugarcane immediately starts to oxidize when it's cut. It ferments. Sorry, windows open because it's very hot. It ferments and it goes rotten if it's not processed quickly. And the harvest season ran 24 hours a day for many weeks. Hence, the harvest season was the most violent and most dangerous time of the year. So the use of two sugarcane cuts is an effective way to demonstrate the normalizing of violence and dehumanization, because no sugar means no profits. And profits always was placed above Black lives. Now, in the second part of my session, I introduced consumption-based activities along with the discussions. We explored the foodways of enslaved people, and I tried to help them reconceptualize slave foodways as what I call culinary resistance. Now, this was to emphasize how often when we think of slave resistance, it's usually conceived as a physical and usually a violent reaction to racialized exploitation, terrorism, and the constraints of chattel slavery. And I wanted the teachers to pull away from this limiting definition of resistance and expand beyond the confines of aggressive protest or rebellion that is all too often conceptualized as a very male-centered activity, even though we know women actively participated. So instead, I urged them to consider forms of covert resistance, particularly those that would be performed by women. So culinary resistance is an intriguing concept because foodways can act as a metaphor for culture and as a marker of identity, denoting class, gender, status, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also a cultural practice that happens every day. And more importantly, it's replete with symbols and meanings associated with social power. Thus, slave foodways operated within this, an arena of multiple conflicts as a point of subtle or covert resistance that in effect had a strong connection to identity formation practices, because you are what you eat. So I would move everyone into a kitchen space as I highlighted some of the culinary commonality across the Black Atlantic. And I had some teachers watch, while others who wanted to participate, they would help me prepare two African diasporic dishes known to be part of foodways of enslaved people, but also still prepared and consumed by descendant communities today. Even my use of the term slave cuisine gave the teachers pause for thought, as they had to reckon with some of their own and perhaps racialized definition of cuisine that it needed to change. And so for this consumption activity, we would make a vegetarian gumbo, which in some areas is called pepper pot or kalalu, and we served it with rice as an example of a diasporic one-pot meal that was very popular throughout the colonial era, as well as some fried plantains that we would use, that are both dishes, the pepper pot and the fried plantains, two food dishes that are still quite popular today. And so in the learning process and the discussion, it's very interactive as we're preparing and cooking these dishes. And the African diasporic dishes that I prepared, we basically consumed them as part of our final dinner of that weekend. So it's a physical and literal consuming of history. The last formalized agenda of action that we had was for the planning of resources for preparation to build capacity in subject knowledge and teaching methods and pedagogy. So in the months that followed, resources were developed by participant teachers who worked in smaller groups, but in consultation with the project team. And 16 of those teachers, as I had said, there were 21 that started, but because of sicknesses and other unfortunate, unforeseen circumstances, it ended up being 16 of the teachers who were able to contribute resources. And those resources were constructed specifically for classroom teaching with seven separate inquiries on African and the Middle Ages of Europe, as well as how similar were West African nations, life and work on a Jamaican plantation, rebellions, revolutions, resistance to slavery, Scotland and the Caribbean connection, as well as the Middle Passage. And each of these inquiries included a PowerPoint with between 1 to 8 PDFs of printable or downloadable resources. And the lesson sequences follow the inquiry approach to lesson planning, in which pupils work alongside the teachers to use primary sources that we supply to answer a legitimate historical question. And some of these questions were, or could be, what did resistance and slavery look like? How similar were the lives of enslaved men and women on Jamaican plantations? How similar were West African nations between 1770 and 1807? How can we learn from personal accounts of the Middle Passage? What was the most significant link between Scotland and the Caribbean? What kinds of relationships did African nations have with Europeans during the Middle Ages? And how similar were enslaved people's rebellions and revolutions in the Caribbean? And so the production of these resources were co-managed by a Glasgow-based company called Broad Talent, known for their participant-led work in filmmaking, animation, and visual arts. And so soon these resources will be hosted on SAF's website, a couple of weeks, hopefully, and anyone will be welcome to download the materials and adapt them for their own classroom, because they are designed to inspire as well as to be used as off the shelf. So during those months that followed the residential weekend, we, alongside with the creation of these resources, we led several workshops in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen for the Teaching Slavery in Scotland teachers to share their experiences with local teachers and provide a testimony of the enriching experience of the residential weekend and the collaborative nature of the project to create and disseminate research-based resources and scholarship to create a story around a particular topic or question on slavery. Now, in the longer term, we will support members of this network to further disseminate their knowledge and expertise to peers and colleagues, including, or rather through regional follow-up workshops. And those goals we're already working on. So I'll conclude with where we are right now. Now, following the success of the pilot year, the Scottish government has offered to fund another year in a somewhat more expansive iteration of the project. So this year, starting in a couple of weeks, we'll be selecting applicants, and those who will be part of the new year will gain access to the University of Glasgow's library, particularly to find and use electronic resources. There will be a launch that they'll attend, which includes an introduction to researching slavery and the slave trade. Those participants will engage in academic-led reading tasks and complete an online part-time course. And they'll also take part in another fully funded residential training weekend with the development of workshops that will be happening in the spring. So teachers will again work together with us to develop new resources and disseminate their knowledge and understanding through an online public panel discussion, hopefully for the summer of 2024. And that is where I will stop. Thank you so much.